Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. This will be episode 10, my reading of My Confession, Recollections of a Rogue by Samuel Chamberlain. And we're getting close to the end, so this will either be the last one or the second to last one, second to last episode. You can read or listen to the whole book. You can find the book, actually. It's out of copyright. You can probably find it at archive.org. And you can listen to all the episodes on William Ramsey Reads History, along with some other notable works that are also out of copyright. So, episode 10, and we are on chapter 36, Expedition to California. The expedition intended for New Mexico and California was fitted out at Walnut Springs in the most complete manner. It consisted of D&E companies, 2nd Dragoons, Troop H of the 2nd Dragoons, 3 troops of the 1st Dragoons, and Bragg's battery of light artillery, now under the command of Lieutenant Kilburn. The cavalry was under the command of Major Lawrence P. Graham, while Brevet Lieutenant Colonel John Washington commanded the entire detachment. Our camp was alive with preparations. Wagons were overhauled, tires reset, new horses and mules purchased at Camargo, all drills discontinued, and everything done by the officers to make the men satisfied of the change. All of us who were enlisted for the war were now mustered out of the army and paid off. I felt sorry to part with my comrades, who seemed to be my only friends, and I also had a strong desire to see California. I called on my friend Miss W. Chapman, whose husband was going along as quartermaster. Through her influence, I obtained the position of wagon master at $65 per month and 2 rations, a much better arrangement than the $7 a month I had been receiving as a dragoon. On the 18th of July, 1848, we bid farewell to Walnut Springs for the last time. The morning was delightful. Birds of the gayest plumage filled the grove. The air was redolent with fragrance from the orange and pomegranate trees. All nature wore a holiday look, as if rejoicing at the departure of the last of the invaders from Mexico. The bugles sounded loud and clear to horse, and the finest appearing column of United States troops that was ever seen debouched from the woods and wound its way past the Black Fort toward Monterey. The entire command was dressed in bright red flannel shirts and broad black brim felt hats. This, with their white belts, burnished arms, gay banners, and dashing horsewomen galloping up and down our flanks, made an effect seldom witnessed in the dull routine of Uncle Sam's service. We went into camp at Arista Mills, and I got my charge of 50 wagons parked, my tent pitched, and was about to dine when a woman rode up with one of the quartermaster clerks, who, pointing me out, said, "This is the man you want," and rode off. I asked the lady's pleasure, and she handed me a note addressed to Pelincillo Jack, BMD, boss mule driver. The note, as near as I can remember, was as follows: "Dear Jack, the bearer of this, Miss Ellen Ramsey, is desirous of going to California, and I have recommended you to her as a suitable party for her to contract a Scotch marriage with, to enable her to do so. She will explain all. Yours, Hugh Elmsdale." This extraordinary epistle was written by a friend of mine, a clerk in the commissary department. I gave a look to the bearer, and certainly my eyes never rested on a finer specimen of womankind, physically, than the same Ellen Ramsey. She was full 6 feet in height, splendidly proportioned, complexioned clear pink and white, eyes a deep blue, with a bright golden hair that fell down her back in heavy ringlets, and dressed in a riding habit of blue velveteen with a cavalier's black hat from which floated a white plume. And this apparition wanted to go to California with me. Woo. She told me her story, that she had landed in Texas in 1847 with other immigrants from Scotland. The smallpox and measles carried off many of them, amongst others Ellen's parents. Reaching San Antonio, she obtained a situation with a lady whose husband was a commissary in the volunteers. With them, she came to Monterey, and now they were returning to Texas. She was desirous of going to California, but an order prohibited all except married females from going with our troops. With blushes, I tried to decline her offer, but she laughed at my bashfulness and said, "After we have lived together for a year, we will know one another better, and then, if we wish, we can marry. If we don't agree, we'll separate in peace." What could I do? There sat this 6 feet of female perfection with a winsome smile on her lips and the innocent look of a child shining from her blue eyes. I done as any sinner would have done, threw down the sponge, surrendered at discretion, and consented, saying, "There's my tent, and Kit, make yourself at home." She done so. Her horse was unsaddled and hitched to the same picket rope as mine. A burro drove up with her baggage, and in 15 minutes I scarce knew my own tent. There was a rug on the ground, a looking glass fixed to the pole, a comfortable looking bed with snow white sheets and pillowcases. Miss Ellen, with her riding habit, changed to a short dress and sleeves rolled up, showing a plump white muscular arm, was hard to work, setting the dinner in better shape. Scotch Ellen, as she was called, made herself mistress in more sense than one, and as she was an excellent cook, owned her own horse, and a good supply of clothing, the arrangement was not so bad after all. I reported my new partnership to Captain Chapman, and he kindly approved. Her example seemed contagious, for just as we were ready to start the next morning, a train of 3 large Chihuahua wagons came in sight around the bed off the road by the Obispado, preceded by a horsewoman who was recognized by all as Sarah Borginas, the celebrated Great Western. She rode up to Colonel Washington and asked permission to accompany the expedition. The colonel referred her to Major Rucker, who informed her that if she would marry one of the dragoons and be mustered in as a laundress, she could go. Her ladyship gave a military salute and replied, "All right, Major. I'll marry the whole squadron, and you throw in but what I go along." Riding along the front of the line, she cried out, "Who wants a wife with $15,000 and the biggest leg in Mexico? Come, my beauties, don't speak all at once. Who's the lucky man?" Whether the thought that the Great Western had one husband in the 7th Infantry and another in Harney's Dragoons made the men hesitate, I know not. But at first no one seemed disposed to accept the offer. Finally, Davis of Company E, the same that flogged Doherty, said, "I have no objections to making you my wife, if there is a clergyman here to tie the knot." With a laugh, the heroine replied, "Bring your blanket to my tent tonight, and I will learn you to tie a knot that will satisfy you, I reckon." Such was the morals of the army in Mexico. Miss Davis Nee Borginis went down on Company E books as laundress and drew rations as such. Besides the Great Western and my Scotch lassie, there was with the command Miss Chapman, Sergeant Delancey's wife, Miss Charlie McSary, and a young servant girl to Miss Chapman. About noon, we resumed our march, Miss Ellen riding by my side, while I gave her a description of my dangerous ride when pursued by guerrillas down this same road. I found my partner more practical than sentimental. When I related how my pants and flesh were torn by the thorny chaparral, without any inquiries about my own suffering, she coolly said, "Pity you threw them away. I could have mended them for you." No romance about that. More than a week later, we finally reached the hacienda of Don Manuel de Sanchez near Parras, having, with much hard work, got the team safely through Paso El Diablo. Colonel Washington remained here 2 days to rest the animals. The horses of the dragoons showed much distress after the long march, but my long-eared charges seemed as fresh as when we left Monterey. After I had my wagons overhauled and some tires set, I went with the fair Ellen into Parras to do a little shopping. In a store we met with Miss Chapman and Miss Delancey. At first I held back, but to my surprise the ladies called me and said I must introduce my lady to them. I did so, when all conventions of society were thrown aside, and the ladies chatted and tried to cheapen the goods together as if on the same footing. After numerous purchases, we stopped at a pasteleria and partook of the sweets and fruits with some excellent Paris vino. A merry, happy hour was spent, and then with the bundles strapped on behind, we returned to camp when social restraints were again enforced. After 2 days' rest, we moved on, and at night we reached a large Hacienda El Poza deep well. It was built like an ancient castle with towers and castellated roof. There was quite a garrison of armed peons, for this estate belonged to the Sanchez family and was very rich in cattle and sheep, but suffered from the annual visitation of the Comanches. It was at this place that a party of Doniphan's command a year before defeated a large party of Comanches, killing 15, and rescuing 23 Mexican girls from captivity. The next day, we reached the small town of Alamo de Paris, where Colonel Washington and Major Graham found the hospitality of the alcalde so great, his wine so good, the senorita so extremely pretty and accommodating, that they ordered Captain Chapman to have all of his wagons repaired, regardless whether they required it or not. This took 4 days, during which we were treated to La Corrida de Toros, or bullfight, in which a female matador appeared and showed considerable muscle and little skill in dispatching some poor old oxen that they tried to persuade us were bulls. Ellen attended all places of amusement with me, and I began to really like and respect the poor girl, who was yet only 18, and until the arrangement with me virtuous, and her living with me she did not regard as being the least wrong, as it was one of the customs of her country. She was perfectly faithful to me, and was in truth a model mistress. I lived better than any officer, dressed well, and my clothes were always in the best of order. She made excellent pies, which she sold, as well as whiskey, sewed for Miss Chapman, and was always busy and good-natured, and I'm sorry to say it, had no better sense than to give her affections to that roving vagabond Peloncillo Jack BMD. Well, with all his faults, he treated her kindly and lovingly, and protected her from all insults, and once bled a forge master by putting a leaden pill into his shoulder for making an improper overture to her. After that, no one even by look would insult the Scotch lassie. Our next stop was at the Noria de Pozo Calvo, a cattle farm on the great road to Chihuahua. Our red-shirted dragoons attracted much attention from the inhabitants of this part of the country, for the only American troops they had seen before were the half-civilized command of Colonel Doniphan that plundered the country from Santa Fe to the Brazos. What an earthly paradise with the country from Paris to this place was. The white walls of haciendas, ranches, and hamlets were to be seen as far as the eye could reach, rising from fields of corn, sugar cane, and barley, while figs, grapes, pears, and watermelons grew in great abundance, and the delicious Paris wine was as free as water. Thereafter, the country became more rugged and barren, with few signs of cultivation but excellent grass. In about a week, we reached the lively little silver mining town of Mapimi, at the foot of the Bolson de Mapimi, Purse of Mapimi, so called from the extraordinary richness of the silver mines in the mountain. We remained here 2 days, and from there on we followed Doniphan's route to Chihuahua. It led over a high tableland, with scattered cattle haciendas and little cultivated land. There were but few objects on the route worthy of notice. Most of the towns consisted of a few miserable adobe houses, with a ruined church on one side of the plaza, and the Casa de Cabildo town hall on the other, a patio El Gallo cockfighting court with a salon de baile dance hall, without which no Mexican could live. At Santa Cruz de Rosales, about 60 miles from Chihuahua, I sketched a monument built to commemorate a victory over the Comanches, who terrorized the country. This quaint affair, the only one in northern Mexico, was designed by the cura of the place. It was built of adobe, rough plastered with cement, and could certainly claim the merit of being original. At the top was a coarse-colored print of the ubiquitous Virgin of Guadalupe. Underneath this was a soldier looking badly frightened. Innocent, practical Ellen, who visited with me, artlessly inquired if it was built to frighten the coyotes away. Santa Cruz de Rosales is famous as the place where the last battle was fought between the Americans and the Mexicans in Chihuahua, March 17, 1848. Our troops, commanded by Colonel Sterling Price of Missouri, stormed the place and captured General Trias, the entire garrison. At Pachimba, only 15 miles from Chihuahua, we laid over 1 day to enable the command to clean up for the grand entry into the capital of the North. The belts of the dragoons were newly pipe-clayed, the arms burnished, and next day, August 26th, we entered Chihuahua, making a fine appearance. There was a large garrison in the city, commanded by Colonel Justiniani. Don Angel Trias was governor. We passed through the city and went into camp near a large building known as Casa Blanca on the bank of a small stream. Chihuahua is the great depot of the state's and Santa Fe trade, and the inhabitants have become well acquainted with Americans through their intercourse with the traders, but they don't seem to have acquired much love for the gringos by this contact. The population of the city is stated to be 15,000, but I should judge this was too high a figure. In honor of the governor, a grand review was given by Colonel Washington, which concluded with a sham fight in which His Excellency was shown the way we whipped his paisanos countrymen. This no doubt proved quite satisfactory, for he expressed himself as highly delighted. While we remained at this place, my ill fortune led me into an adventure in which I came near losing my life. One evening, Sergeant Moore and Jack Jones of my old company took supper with me and Ellen. After it was over, the sergeant proposed a ramble in town. The fearful events of that evening deserve a separate chapter. Chapter 37, A Night's Adventure in Chihuahua. We reached town and strolled around for some time, drinking freely at different fondas, until we brought up at the Salon de Bay, where a fandango was in full blast. The room was full of ugly-looking cutthroats who greeted our entrance with fierce carajos and ribald jests. Common prudence should have caused us to retire, but that wasn't our style, so we swaggered up to the bar and called for the drinks. Then, selecting for partners 3 of the best-looking senoritas in the room, we took places on the floor and called for a dance when Moore cried out, "I am cut." A greaser had knifed him in the side. My revolver was out in a moment, and seeing an ugly yellow belly sneaking for the door, I sprang upon the banqueta, fired over the heads of the crowd, and shot the bravo in the back. With a yell, he fell dead. The women disappeared through back doors while the men drew their knives and made a rush for us, but we had gained a good position behind the bar. 2 more shots laid out 2 more of them, and they fell back and crowded together at the further end of the hall. We gathered from their chattering that they had sent for firearms, so our only chance was to work quickly. I loaded the 3 empty chambers of my revolver, the only pistol in the party, while Moore, who was bleeding profusely, and Jones broke up a huge oaken settle and made clubs of the legs. Then, swinging the body part, we let it go when at its greatest momentum. It flew across the room and struck the mob with the force of a battering ram, bringing at least half of them to the floor. With loud yells, we charged them with clubs, and they fled through a rear door. After the victory, our first act was to strengthen our position. The doors were secured by the heavy bars, and the settle and tables piled against them. We put out the candles and felt quite safe, as it was a stone house. The windows well protected by iron rejas, like a prison. Seated in the angle of the room by Moore, we awaited events. We could hear the low muttering of the mob outside, and suddenly a volley of pistol balls was poured into the room through the open reja, but we were protected by being out of the line of fire. It was now near midnight, and I felt satisfied that we could hold out until daylight, when Allen, alarmed at my absence, would report it, and a patrol would be sent into town to hunt us up. Shots continued to be fired through the different windows when on a sudden all sound ceased, except a rushing noise as of a mob in flight. Soon the regular tramp of soldiers sounded on the stone pavement. A sharp command in Spanish and the ring of muskets told the arrival of a patrol. At a loud rap on the door, followed by the command to open, I asked who was there. La Patrola, came the answer. It would have been madness to resist soldiers, so we pulled away the barricade, unbarred the door, and there entered a lieutenant carrying a lantern and half a dozen soldiers. We were made prisoners. The other soldiers came in, and the dead greasers examined. I gleaned from the remarks of the lieutenant that he was much pleased at something, and that we were all right. Carajo, chingara. Esto hombre está encebado, he exclaimed as he kicked over the ladron when I first shot. Then he informed us that he would protect us to camp, and for our own safety, we had better keep quiet about the affray. Moore was got up and could, with little assistance, walk very well. His cut, though long, was not very deep, and having secured several bottles of Pass whiskey, we left the house, and with an escort of a sergeant and 6 soldiers, we took our way through the now silent streets for camp. Nothing was seen of the mob. The moon had risen, bathing one side of the street in a flood of light, while on the other the grotesque shadows of the quaint Moorish buildings gave a weird aspect to the scene. We had now reached a long street that led direct to camp, and the guard left us after cautioning us again to keep silent on the adventures of the night. What followed, I must confess, I am not very clear about. We had drunk freely in the dance hall, and now we seated ourselves on the sidewalk, on the moonlit side, and refreshed ourselves again from the Agariente del Paso, Moore taking his share. We drank the health of the courteous officer and the patrol, drank confusion to all ladrones, and my health was drunk for my good shooting, and then I was called for a song, the Battle of Buena Vista, 400 happy verses, 400 verses, composed by our poet Happy Jack Coe, 1st Dragoons. The first verse is as follows. It was on the 22nd, the day, it being clear, we espied the advancing army of Mexican lancers. At 2 o'clock they fired a shot when we returned the same. Damn ye eyes, old Zack cries, for now commenced the game. So cheer up, my lively lads, for it never shall be said that the 1st Dragoons was ever yet afraid. I had commenced on the second verse when we suddenly received a shower of rocks from the dark side of the street. Then we were rushed by a crowd. I received a blow in the head as if from a sledgehammer, and my face was covered with blood. Black faces and glittering knives were all around me. I felt faint and thought my time has come, but the idea of being hacked to pieces gave me the desperation of madness. Giving them the contents of 4 of the chambers of my revolver, I dashed through the crowd with a yell more savage than their own, using my pistol as a club. Moore and Jones were bounding down the street like deer, well ahead of me. I was no longer weak and faint. I seemed to fly and reached the bank of the river 100 yards ahead of my pursuers. Here I found Moore lying in a faint. Jones was not in sight. My danger and bloodletting had fully sobered me, and I realized the condition of things at a glance. I could easily reach camp alone. Our white tents shone in the moonlight, almost within stone throw. But my duty was plain, to save the sergeant or go under with him. I raised him onto my back, and with his arms around my neck, I gathered his legs under my arms and waded into the river, which was over 2 feet deep and 20 yards wide. Stones flew around us. One hit Moore in the back with a sickening thud, bringing me to my knees. I arose, staggered, and fell into the cool water. I knew the devils were on me, but I could do no more. When there reached me a woman's voice crying out, "Courage, Jack, I am here, courage." Then round oaths in good English and several shots followed, and I was pulled out of the river onto the bank and found myself supported in the arms of Miss Ellen with a number of dragoons around me. I was assisted to my tent where a surgeon found my scalp badly bruised and cut, but my thick skull still sound. Moore, who was a great favorite with the officers, was taken to the hospital tent. Next day, Major Rucker called on me and gave me a regular dang and swore, as only Black Dan could swear, that it was all my fault, and if Moore died, he would have me hung. There's gratitude for you. Jones, finding that Moore could go no further than the river, and hearing my shots, had concluded that I had gone up, so he had put for camp and found Ellen at the guardhouse, anxious for my safety. She and the guard doubled quick to the river and arrived just in time. Rucker investigated the affair, and Colonel Justin Iani, the Mexican commander, informed him that an officer commanding a patrol reported that in endeavoring to arrest a band of ladrones, he had met with resistance, and the patrol had killed 5 of them, one of whom was a famous assassin, one Ramirez, known as El Scorpion, for whose head there was a reward of $1,000. This reward had been paid to the valorous lieutenant. No wonder he wanted us to keep silent. Chapter 38, the marriage, 38, excuse me. Chapter 38, the marriage of Scotch Ellen. Ellen for some days had been blue and gloomy and refused all explanation, and to my repeated inquiry of what was the matter would reply nothing. We went one day on a long walk up the river, and at length, after much urging, she confessed her troubles. She had received an offer of marriage. One McPherson, a countryman of hers, also a wagon master with the train going to Santa Fe, had been for some time smitten with her charms, and now that he was about to be separated, he had spoken out, and in spite of the position his lady love occupied, had made her an honorable offer of his heart, hand, and blankets. Ellen said that if I offered the least objection to the match, she would refuse the offer and go with me to California, but that she was convinced I would never marry her, and as she now had a chance to become an honest woman, she did not think it right for her to throw it away. I was raving at first and thought of calling the Scotch poacher to account, but my better nature prevailed, for I knew that the marriage was the best thing for the poor girl's happiness. Ellen was too good a woman for such a fate as would fall to her if she continued to follow the fortunes of so reckless a rover as Peloncillo Jack, Esquire. That evening I sent for the would-be Benedict, and we three talked the matter over, and I gave my free consent to their unity. The marriage proved quite an epoch in camp. It took place at headquarters on the last day of our encampment in Chihuahua. A cura of the city tied the knot, assisted by Lieutenant Wilson, who, to make all sure, performed it over again, reading the service from an Episcopal prayer book. I gave the bride away. Miss Chapman and Miss Delancey were present, and appeared much impressed with the solemnity of the ceremony. Colonel Washington, Majors Graham and Rucker gave the fair bride a chaste salute, and the happy couple departed hand in hand to the bridegroom's tent, home, i.e., his tent. I returned to my once happy but now solitary abode, and felt desolate enough. Our horses no longer munched barley from the same trough. Her brass-bound trunk was no longer in its accustomed place against the tent pole. The bed, robbed of half its blankets, looked shrunken and mean. Her jaunty riding hat no longer hung from its nail, and the whiskey keg was gone. When too late, I was sorry that I had let her go, and found I was not quite so much of a saint as I thought. Chapter 39, A Ranger's Life in Sonora. The next day, the entire command marched 16 miles and encamped at Sacramento, the scene of battle between Colonel Doniphan and a much superior force of Chihuahuans. In the morning, Lieutenant Colonel Washington, with Kilburn's battery, the 1st Dragoons, and Troop H of the 2nd Dragoons, started for Santa Fe via El Paso, while the remainder under Major L.P. Graham moved off on a road to the left for California. Most of the country to the northwest of Chihuahua was at this time practically unknown to the rest of the world. The citizens of Chihuahua gave us vague tradition of great cities in the far north, inhabited by white Indians called pintos, of rivers that run over beds of gold pebbles, of beautiful women who fought mounted and ate their prisoners. In short, the most fabulous stories were told us. I must confess that I rather took stock in these romances, for a warm imagination had prepared me to expect many strange and startling adventures in the unknown land. It was in the month of September when we left Sacramento. The air was clear and bracing, and we were yet in a cultivated country, but in one where every house was fortified, and numerous wooden crosses by the wayside marked the scene of murder by the dread Apaches. Our march so far had been a success, and the command was as good in as good a condition as when we left Monterey. But now the total incompetency of Major Graham for a separate command was made manifest to the most obtuse intellect. The marches were ill-timed, without proper care for grass and water. In a country of plenty, our animals suffered for forage. We lay by at all haciendas, especially if the mujeres was mucha bonita, consuming our provisions and even selling them to the greasers. Lack of discipline in the dragoons, and worse in the quartermaster department, threatened the worst results to the expedition. Major Rucker and Captain Chapman done their duty nobly, but with a drunken, ignorant commander who seemed to delight in acts of petty tyranny, little could be done. After several days' march from Sacramento, we reached a branch of the Rio Yaqui, the banks of which for miles were covered with peach trees, full of ripe, delicious fruit. A large, well-armed party from New Mexico was encamped here, engaged in collecting and drying the fruit for the Santa Fe market. We remained here 2 days, and found a great plenty of sweet pumpkins, corn, and barley, with ruins of ranches and haciendas scattered up and down the valley, while wild cattle was plenty, and so fat as to appear all body. With the party from New Mexico was a man of remarkable size and strength. Madame Sarah Borginis Davis, the great Western, saw this Hercules while he was bathing, and conceived a violent passion for his gigantic proportions. She sought an interview, and with blushes told her love. The Samson, nothing loth, became the willing captive to this modern Delilah, who straightway kicked Davis out of her affections and tent, and established her elephantine lover in full possession without further ceremony. Our route after we left the peach orchard on the Rio Yaqui was over a barren desert of sand and rocks, mountains, and deep, precipitous valleys. The vegetation was remarkable. Many new species of the cactus family appeared, among them the gigantic pitahaya, a monster cactus rising in a single fluted column to the height of 40 to 60 feet. Sometimes they display four or more arms that rise from the sides with great regularity and present the appearance of a gigantic candelabra. They bear a fruit something like a prickly pear, of a sickly Swedish taste. This strange vegetable grows on rocks and in sandy places where even gammer grass cannot be found. Since we left Chihuahua, I had found my position anything but a pleasant one. One thing, since I had parted with Ellen, I drank to excess. I always had a supply along in a wagon, but I had never allowed drink to interfere with my duty. But now everything went wrong. The air was so warm and dry that it took all the life out of the command. Men and animals seemed to lose all of their vitality and dry up. Wagons fell to pieces, tires came off, spokes came out. Constant halting to repair broken down wagons soured the disposition of all, while Major Graham, old pigeon toes, cursed all and everything, I coming in for more than my share of the general abuse. One day one of my wagons broke down, and while I was repairing it, the confounded major must ride up. As usual, he damned and swore at me, and said he would disrate me and make me drive a team. I very imprudently replied that as he had the power, he might as well do as he might as well damned please. The major's natural red face now glowed like a furnace, and swearing to hang me, he told his orderly to bring me along a prisoner. I made no resistance and rode along in silence until we reached the guard, when my horse and revolver was taken from me and I was obliged to frog it. I walked for days, but this kind of marching was not very hard, as the command did not average over 15 miles per day, and the guard was from my old squadron, who permitted me to ride when the major was out of sight. One day near Tucson, we emerged from a wilderness of mesquite and cottonwoods into an open space where, arising from the huts, an Indian village was one of the grandest church edifices of northern Mexico, the mission of San Javier del Bac, built in 1668. The village was inhabited by a tribe of Indians known as the Papagos, with no white men or Mexicans nearer than Tucson. The buildings are in an excellent condition, with a number of fine paintings and images well preserved. The mission appears to be unknown in Mexico, and is certainly a most remarkable edifice, standing as it does in the midst of a desert, the home of the wild, savage Apaches. I was sketching the place from my guardhouse, a scaffold used by the Papagos to dry pumpkin on, when Graham rode up and saw me. "What in the hell have you got there?" was his polite inquiry. I respectfully replied, "My sketchbook, Major." "Sketchbook, you damned hound. What in hell do you know about sketching?" And riding up, he snatched the book from my hands, and after glancing at its contents, threw it in my face. Then turning to the sergeant of the guard, he said, "Tie Pencillo Jack up for 2 hours, then put handcuffs on him, and see if he can sketch then." I was accordingly tied up. Graham's tent was in plain sight, and he rode up to it and, dismounting, took up a position where he could watch me. What dignity! A major of the U.S. Dragoons and commander of an important expedition, tormenting a poor boy, a citizen at that, and watching his guard to see if his brutal orders were carried out. Yet the man was brave. He led the charge at the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, for which May received the credit. When my 2 hours were up, I was cut down and ironed, but the pair was so large that I could slip them off and on with the greatest ease. Next day we made a short march to Tucson, when again, in spite of Graham and handcuffs, I sketched the old mined Presidio, but he saw me and I got another damning and was tied up again. This Tucson is a very hot place, and being tied up in the sun, I was in a fair way of becoming tasajo, or jerked beef. I could feel my brains sizzling, and my skin was commencing to crack, when a strange white man strode up to the guardhouse, and after taking in the situation at a glance, drew a bowie knife and coolly cut me down. He was seized by the guard, and in spite of desperate resistance, was tied up himself. He was a small, dried-up, wiry man, dressed in a half-Indian, half-Mexican costume, and armed with a heavy Kentuck rifle, revolver, and a huge bowie knife. His actions and language was strange and highly ludicrous. He would howl like a coyote, bellow like a bull, crow like a cock, bray until all the mules joined in the chorus, and intermingle all this with strange oaths and expressions in a mixture of Spanish, English, and Chinook. Higher, usted, dead, damned pork eaters, he said. You got hold of the wrong hombre, carajo. I'm that old buffalo, Tom Hitchcock, crying to be tied up like buffalo calf, bellowing like a buffalo bull. Hellfire, shooty me, what will Glanton say? He ended with a prolonged howl of a prairie wolf, then broke down crying like a child. I was tied up alongside of him, and the name he mentioned recalled to my memory the tragic scene I had witnessed at the Bexar Exchange, San Antonio, Texas. I engaged him in conversation and learned he belonged to a band of Indian hunters employed by Don D. Jose Urrea, governor of Sonora. The band was known as the Scalp Hunters and was commanded by John Glanton of Texas, the desperado of the Bexar Exchange. We were cut down by order of Lieutenant Coots, officer of the day, and the Free Ranger was taken before Major Graham, who interrogated him to his business in Tucson, the route between the place and the Rio Gila, and obtained about as much information from Crying Tom as he would from a mule. Hitchcock was returned to the guardhouse, and I informed him that I had made up my mind to escape and join Clanton's company. He, with much bluntness, advised me to join Satan and go to hell at once. But finding I was in earnest, he promised to help me all he could. A plan was agreed on, and I laid down to sleep, but my mind was too active to rest. The step I was about to take, to separate myself from all civilization and friends, to join a band of outlaws, for such the scalp hunters were considered, even by the half-savage frontiersmen, was an act to make one think and reflect. In the morning, Tom Hitchcock was released and his arms restored to him, and with a significant look at me, the ranger departed crying. During our march this day, a solitary horseman was seen hanging on our rear and was pronounced by the officers an Apache scout, but I knew it was my lacrymal outlaw, Crying Tom Hitchcock. Finding water a little after noon, we went into camp. When I saw the figure of the horseman in bold relief against the sky, he was standing by a lofty pitahaya that grew on a rocky mesa overlooking the camp. I waved a handkerchief 3 times, the signal agreed on. Then came the answer, the cry of a coyote, and the horseman disappeared. I sent for Captain Chapman, and making a plausible excuse, I asked him to pay for 2 months, $75. At this time, I had over $400 of my own, so I had plenty. I now took one of the guard into my confidence, Happy Jack of Company A. He was under an obligation to me, and was glad to assist me in anything that lay in his power. After dark, I succeeded in eluding the sentinel, and with my blanket, sketchbook, etc., I reached a solitary Alamo, and was soon joined by Happy Jack with my horse, revolver, and knife. Beside my regular kit, I found 2 holster pistols in the holsters and a long-range Hall rifle with plenty of ammunition. Without questioning the right of Happy Jack to make the donation, I accepted the gifts in the same liberal spirit that they were given in, and with a hearty pressure of the hand, but a sinking heart, I bid my old comrade goodbye. Mounting, I turned my back on the camp and rode forth in the dark desert, friendless and alone. I reached the mesa, dismounted, and with much difficulty led up my horse, and seated myself near the huge cactus where I last saw Hitchcock. I looked back on the camp in the valley, the fires flaring up brightly among the cottonwoods, lighted up the white covered wagons, and disclosed the forms of men as they passed in front of the blaze. A deep silence prevailed, only broken by the occasional bray of a mule and the prolonged melancholy cry of a coyote from the plain. How I regretted the step I had taken. Who was Glanton or Hitchcock? What would be my fate with such desperadoes? Would I ever see Boston and home again? These and similar thoughts flitted through my brains until I'd quite broke down and cried like a child. Come to the test, I found I was not so much of the heroic mold as I imagined, and would have been glad to be back in the guardhouse, and march to California in irons, anywhere but in this terrible desert solitude. I was aroused from my gloomy thoughts by a heavy hand on my shoulder, and the howl of a coyote in my ear. Springing up, I confronted the eccentric ranger, who said, "What, crying? This old buffalo don't allow anyone to cry but himself. You're a fine colt to hitch to John Glanton, ye are. Carajo, ye ain't worth shucks." In his presence, all my feelings of despondence fled. I was ready for adventure. We started from the mesa and took the trail back to Tucson. About an hour's march beyond the place, we turned off the trail to our left and passed up a canyon for some distance. Tom dismounted and led the way into the intense darkness that shut us in like a wall. We moved on for more than an hour in silence when the ranger halted and said, "We'll rest here tonight, muchacho." After a hearty meal of pinola and tasajo, Tom carefully put out the fire, and we lay down well wrapped up in our blankets, and I was soon sound asleep. When I awoke, it was in the gray morning, and Tom was up and breakfast ready. We had passed the night in a wild gorge of what he called the Sierra Chiricahua, Chiricahua, a retired place well known to Glanton's band of scalp hunters. Saddling up, we retraced our steps on foot until we struck a trail that descended the side of the canyon in a zigzag manner. Up this we climbed with much difficulty, and it was 2 hours before we reached a level place to rest ourselves and our weary animals. Though it was now the middle of October, and the clouds hanging around the peaks of the mountains gave notice that the rainy season would soon commence, yet the sun's rays were hot and overpowering. The scene was drear and desolate. Rocks piled on rocks showed the most irregular and grotesque forms, some black and charred as by the action of volcanic fires. Others, composed of marl and sandstone, had the appearance of ancient castles, with towers, battlements, and fortified walls. Below us lay San Javier and Tucson, looking like toy houses, while away off to the north, a long cloud of dust and little white specks showed the position of the Graham expedition. We rode now in an easterly direction. My hitherto taciturn guide became more loquacious and gave me an insight into the wild, lawless life led by the Indian hunters of Sonora. Glanton was paid $50 for every Apache scalp brought in. He had recently returned from an unsuccessful hunt in the Navajos country, where in an encounter with the Navajos he had lost 11 men and not a scalp to show for it. He was now encamped at the Presidio of Fronteras, and hearing of a large body of Americans on the road north of Chihuahua, he had dispatched several of his men to intercept the command at different points to obtain recruits if possible. Crying Tom, not relishing his treatment in camp, was glad to get cut off with a whole skin and my humble self. We pushed on as rapidly as the nature of the ground would permit. The heat was fearful. Our suffering animals were kept up under the application of our heavy spurs. We descended to a tableland or elevated plain on which the pitahaya grew in abundance. The ranger cut one down with his knife, and with my assistance cut off the thorny fluted outside. The succulent inside we gave to our horses, who fed on it with much relish. We had crossed halfway over the plain when Crying Tom pointed out in the distance to our right what at first appeared to me nothing but a long line of yuccas or Spanish bayonets. But I soon saw they had motion and made out a long column of horsemen in single file, Apaches on the war trail. Soon they collected in little squads, then started across the plain, direct for us. I became alarmed and half turned my horse to fly, but my companion not only showed no signs of fear, but appeared delighted. And as they came yelling across the plain, brandishing their long lances and rattling their bull-hide shields, Tom yelled and shouted and slapped himself. I told the ranger that I thought I might fetch one with my rifle, but he damned me for a fool. However, I dismounted, and using my saddle for a rest, I drew a bead on a big chap and fired, when the huge savage sprang with a yell to the ground. His companions used their quirts freely on their ponies until out of range. Hitchcock sprang off and embraced me with odd expressions of delight, hugged and kissed to him the miraculous rifle, and pronounced it a big medicine that shoot a heap. The wounded warrior presented a ghastly sight, and he tried to call his pony to him, but the affrighted animal stood at a distance, snorting in terror. The savage then gave a wild, startling yell, and by his hands alone dragged himself to the brink of a deep barranca. Then, singing his death chant and waving his hand in defiance towards us, he plunged into the awful abyss. "50 pesos gone to the hell, muchacho," cried Tom. "The doggone, mean red done that thar to cheat us out of his hair." We moved on in silence, for somehow my agency in the death of the warrior affected me greatly. I felt as if I had committed a murder. Conscience said, "You were safe, he never harmed you, and he was on his own soil, yet you killed him." Crossing the plain, we entered a ravine that ascended the gloomy mountain. We toiled on for hours up its narrow bed, with walls of rock rising on each side, shutting us in from all view outside. We crossed the summit at sunset and began to descend. The light began to fade out. The canyon became dark and forbidding, and soon all was gloom, and the darkness of a dungeon prevailed. My strange companion who led the way disappeared. The sound of his horse's hooves on the rocky bed of the canyon ceased. All was still. I was beginning to feel alarmed at the desertion of the ranger when a wild shriek of laughter, which seemed to burst forth from the solid rock above my head, was caught up and repeated from 1,000 points. Then fierce whoops burst forth, mingled with stunning reports of firearms and wild yells. That I was in the midst of a terrific combat in which hundreds were engaged, I had not the least doubt, for my safety was my first consideration. I sprang off, and feeling a huge boulder in the intense blackness, I pulled my footsore steed behind it and made ready for a struggle. No one assailed me. The noise of the conflict seemed to die away up the mountain with an occasional loud report, as of artillery. I was stupefied at the strangeness of this mysterious battle in the darkness, when suddenly the rocky walls were lit up by a bright light held by a wild-looking figure. I drew a bead and was about to fire when I recognized my quondam companion. Tom cried out, "Muchacho, you're welcome to Tom Hitchcock's Rancho El Fonda del Cienguilla. Entra, hombre. Tote your caballo to my casa." By the light of his mesquite torch, I saw a narrow opening in the wall, rising up in rough, irregular steps. My tired animal at first refused to climb, but with Tom's assistance, we arrived in safety at a large cave, 50 feet above the bed of the ravine. I was full of curiosity to know more of this magician of a ranger who kept a hotel in the wild desert. Tom replenished the fire, produced from a nook in the wall a coffee pot, a frying pan, jerked beef, and a large leather bag of panola. We made an excellent supper, and then my magician took from his mysterious cupboard one of those double-headed gourds used for canteens by the greaser, and to my delight I found it contained past whiskey, the pure aguardiente of El Paso. Then this good genie brought out a crock or ollo and a bag of beans or frijoles, and soon the crock was on the fire to be in readiness for the morning's repast. A spring of clear, cold water ran through the back part of the cavern. In fact, nothing appeared wanting to make us comfortable. The cave was admirably adapted for concealment and defense. It contained numerous winding galleries and compartments running through the cliff, 100 feet above the bottom of the ravine, and was often used by Glanton's men who kept provisions and fuel stored here. It possessed a remarkable echo, a specimen of which had so alarmed me. A single-shot rifle, sundry whoops and yells had the effect of a severe conflict in which hundreds were engaged. Tom also told of mysterious noises, groaning and sighing, with occasional heavy reports, which he credited to some supernatural agency, though he said that Judge Holden, one of Glanton's men, said they were caused by the wind and called the earth's colic. These strange sounds, combined with the echo, had a powerful influence on the savage hordes, who always avoided the canyon, though it was the best path through the Sierra for hundreds of miles. We slept safe and sound, though the dying Indian troubled me in my dreams. In the morning, when all was yet dark in our rocky world, we ate our breakfast, saddled up, and after carefully removing all traces of our visit, we led our rested steeds down the steps and left Hitchcock's ranch. As we moved down the pass, we tried the powder of the echo, and I'm satisfied it repeated over 20 times. At one place away up on the side appeared walls built by the hand of man, or what I judge to be such from my point of observation. The whole place is worthy of a scientific exploration, and no doubt many interesting discoveries would be made. The rocks are marl, sand, and limestone.